Hello A2, welcome to Circadian rhythms, Ultradian and Infradian rhythms. These are all known as biological rhythms on the spec, and the only one we're going to look at today is circadian rhythms. We'll briefly touch on Ultradian and Infradian, but you'll look more closely at them next week. So just so you're aware of the wording on the spec, what you need to know is these are all biological rhythms. So if you're asked about biological rhythms, you could talk about circadian rhythms, Ultradian or Infradian rhythms. And the key thing is you need to know the difference between them. You could be asked a question explaining the difference between circadian and infradian rhythms. The key thing with any kind of difference between question might be the difference between EEGs and ERPs, or anything at all that you can think of. You can't just put a sentence, EEGs measure the general state of the brain, full stop. ERPs measure the brain's response to a specific stimulus, or circadian rhythms are 24 hours, stop. Infradian rhythms are anything over 24 hours. You need to have, believe it or not, no additional information, but you need to say whereas, or you need to make it clear there's a comparison. So circadian rhythms are 24 hours, whereas infradian rhythms are over 24 hours. That would get you marks, the other one wouldn't, okay? So just bear that in mind. And then you're also going to look at the effects of endogenous pacemakers and exogenous sight gapers on the sleep-wake cycle, which is a type of circadian rhythm. So, circadian rhythms. Ooh, yeah, there we go. Circadian rhythms, we'll go back to that slide in a minute. Circadian rhythms are a rhythm or a cycle that is around 24 hours long. So circa, around, and then diem, which is almost like dien, is Latin for day. So circa, around, and then dien, day. Whereas infradian rhythms, as I've mentioned, are longer than 24 hours, and ultradian ones are under 24 hours. And I remember the U in ultradian as the U for under 24 hours, and that helps me remember the difference between them. And then, of course, DN for day. Okay, so the circadian rhythm, which is the one we're going to focus on today, and we're going to particularly look at the sleep-wake cycle, although there is also body temperature and hormone production. So the sleep-wake cycle hopefully runs in a 24-hour cycle, where you will fall asleep and wake up within a 24-hour period. Now, there is research which we'll get onto later about maybe why your sleep-wake cycle doesn't fit perfectly into a circadian rhythm. However, we generally find there's a particular dip or circadian trough at 2 till 4 a.m. in the morning and 1 till 3. So 1 till 3 in the afternoon, after you've eaten your lunch. It's actually nothing to do with the fact you're digesting your food, because they've done tests where people haven't eaten anything, they still find this lull. It's because it's the natural circadian trough dip in your energy levels for some reason. And then between 2 till 4 a.m. is when you're most asleep, generally say most asleep, although you will look at sleep-wake cycle and have the sleep cycle in ultradian rhythms, which is a 90-minute cycle in which you sleep, which will go against that a little bit. But 2 to 4 in the morning is probably when you're most sleepy. And what they found is there's a correlation between the dip in the circadian trough and cognitive ability. So they generally argue that that's perhaps when your body is closest to shutting down or being at default setting, and that's why they find a lot of people die around that time in hospital. That might be more of an anecdotal comment than a piece of research that's done, but the suggestion is that if they're not very unwell anyway and they dip to a certain point, then because of the circadian trough, and then they can't get back out of it to carry on living. So there we go, there's that. It's affected by both endogenous pacemakers, and the key thing we look at, the belief is that the circadian rhythms are mostly moderated and balanced, managed by endogenous pacemakers, and we'll look at that term in a moment. However, exogenous sight gapers do also entrain the endogenous pacemakers to keep it at the sleep-wake cycle as a 24-hour. Just remember that, it'll make more sense when we talk about something else in a minute. Got homeostatic control, which just means that if you didn't get much sleep last night, then should get sleepier earlier and fall asleep for longer the next night. So it just moderates it. Whereas if you've had a perfectly good night's sleep, enough sleep last night, you might be able to stay up later, or you'll have the same amount. You'll want to fall asleep at the normal time. Okay. And then I think EP and EZ stand for exogenous the endogenous pacemakers and the exogenous site gapers. Body temperature is something else that runs in a 24-hour cycle, and sleep-wake cycle and body temperature both closely linked circadian rhythms. And as you can see, the body temperature is the lowest at 4:30 a.m. and then slightly later than the circadian trough, the sleep-wake cycle. It's highest at 6 p.m. And again, they have found cognitive functions are linked to that. So generally, we do find that about 4 o'clock in the morning is when people's cognitive their cognitive processing dips the most. I'm sure you're all aware that you can all think of people who've made very, very poor decisions at 4 o'clock in the morning for many different reasons, but you could argue it's because of the circadian trough. And also it's highest at 6 p.m. and they did find that there is some research that suggests that children, when they're read a story, can remember more about that information if they read it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So not quite as late as 6, but later on, whereas earlier in the morning they can't remember, and they think that's linked to the sleep-wake cycle and also body temperature and also hormone production. There is a 24-hour cycle of hormone production, but it's better to remember that one when we look at infradian rhythms. However, there is a cycle of 24 hours where hormone production alters throughout that 24 hours. So that is a circadian rhythm, and you can talk, when you're asked about circadian rhythms around 24 hours long, that's what you can talk about. Okay. Endogenous pacemakers are the things that control the internal mechanisms that control the circadian rhythm. So, and they're the key sort of controlling factor. So you've got here the mechanisms which govern internal biological rhythm. Sounds much fancier. I remember that because, and this will explain why there's these odd pictures down the side here. The one in the middle, just here, is a pacemaker. I imagine a lot of you will have heard of people having pacemakers put in to help the heart beating. Now, this type of endogenous pacemaker doesn't really have anything to do with that. There is a bit of a link, but doesn't really have anything to do with that. However, I just remember the word pacemaker and then generally find that pacemakers are internal. So I've got a picture underneath of somebody who's had their pacemaker put in. It's internal, it's inside their chest. So that's how I remember endogenous pacemakers internal. The key master clock, the key endogenous pacemaker, is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. What I would recommend is it's not essential, however, if you feel fairly comfortable with it, I would recommend that you can spell it, you write it out the first time, open brackets, SCN, and then after that you just refer to it as the SCN. But it's, like I say, but it's not the most important thing. I'd rather you know all the information first. You can also watch the YouTube video. There's a little bit of extended detail for anyone who's interested in biology or is struggling a little bit with this. It might be better to have a bit of additional content to have a think about. It's in the SCN is in the hypothalamus, and it's just above the crossing of the nerve fibres in the optic chiasm, and that's why it's called. That's why it's called what it's called as well. And again, if you have a look at the very, very top image, don't worry about being able to name everything. However, you do know that the optic nerves cross because of lateralization. So the left eye goes to the right side of the brain, the right eye goes to the left side of the brain. And just at where they cross, that is where it's placed. And that's because it's the best place to get information about the light, of course, in the middle of the eyes. And it collects information from light. It's called the master clock because it links the brain and it has links and controls other areas of the body. So what it says here is neurons within the SCN synchronize. That means that all the neurons pick up the light information and synchronize, and then that means that there are target peripheral clocks or oscillators. So there's neurons individual. There's neurons within the SCN that are linked to peripheral clocks or oscillators outside the body. So we have lots of different oscillators that help the whole body stay at the same time. So the reason it's called the master clock, if you ever heard of, they had grandfather clocks in the Victorian period. Those lovely, beautiful clocks. They set the time, and then everybody in the house would have little clocks, say pocket watches or whatever, and they would set their clock in the morning running to that master clock. So they were all running at the same time. So if they knew they all had to be back for 4 o'clock, all their clocks were running at the same time, so they'd all say 4 o'clock at the same time. And it's the same thing. So the SCN takes information in about light, and we do have a diagram about this in a minute if you're not sure, takes the information in about light, and then the neurons in the SCN synchronize with each other, and then they talk to the target neurons in other parts of the body. They talk to the peripheral clocks in the other parts of the body, or the peripheral oscillators, so the whole body is on the same sleep-wake cycle, the same circadian rhythm. Don't panic. If you're struggling with this now, there is a diagram that will make it clearer, and we'll go over it again and again and again, okay? So what happens then, another endogenous pacemaker, is the pineal gland. And the SCN sends information to the pineal gland, which then increases or decreases the amount of melatonin based on whether there's more or less light. Okay, and melatonin is the hormone, and some of you might have heard of it. People who struggle to sleep, they take melatonin supplements because the more melatonin you have, it inhibits the brain's mechanism. So it doesn't promote wakefulness; it does the opposite of that. So I'm not sure why my slide says that. Melatonin makes you sleepy. And what we'll do now is we'll have a look at that diagram we had at the start of the PowerPoint slide. So if that completely threw you, don't panic, have a go with this. So what happens is low levels of light are detected by the retina. So the fact that the sun is setting, and that's not the sun, so don't get confused with that. I'll explain the images at the bottom in a minute. So as the sun sets, imagining there's no artificial light, the retina picks this up. There's a protein called, and I apologise for my pronunciation, melanopsin, which is there's cells of those in the retina. They detect the fact that there's lower levels of light, and that takes the information from the eye to the SCN. The SCN then goes, oh, there's low levels of light, and that sends that information down the axon pathway. So as you know, we've got all the axons and the neurons are connected, so it goes through that pathway made up of axons to the pineal gland. The pineal gland then, because it's low levels of light, reduces the amount of melatonin, and because of that you fall to sleep. Increases the amount of melatonin, and because of that you fall asleep. Apologies there. So low levels of light are picked up by the retina, the signal is carried to the SCN, which then sends it to the pineal gland. Because there's low levels of light, melatonin is increased, which then causes sleep. Now these images down here are to help. So I think of M for melatonin and then M for the moon. And as the moon goes up, i.e. when it's late at night, as the moon goes up, melatonin increases as well. They're not linked in any way. It's just that it then reminds me, if the moon's up, well, it must be night. So there's increased melatonin. So therefore, because there's increased melatonin, because the moon's up, then we're more likely to fall asleep, or melatonin makes us fall asleep. And then it works in reverse as well. As the retina picks up higher levels of light, signals are sent to the SCN, which then sends information to the pineal gland. The pineal gland reduces the amount of melatonin, reduces the amount of melatonin, and then we start to wake up. So as the moon goes down, melatonin goes down, and we start to wake up. Again, the moon and melatonin not linked, but it's just M for moon, M for melatonin, and then I think, well, if the moon's up, the melatonin's up because it's night. If the moon's going down, melatonin goes down because it's in the daytime, so I need to be awake. Okay. So they are endogenous pacemakers, which regulate the sleep-wake cycle. If you ever heard of somebody talking about an internal body clock, they are the things that is our internal body clock. There's the SCN, which is the key master clock, and then the pineal gland. And then the peripheral oscillators are like the little clocks that are being set by the SCN, by the master clock, and they're in things like our liver. Trying to think where else it might be. There's an argument, there's some in our skin, lots of different places throughout the whole body, in our heart, things like that. Okay. There is, however, another type of mechanism which helps regulate our sleep-wake cycle. So we've looked at endogenous pacemakers. Pacemakers, thinking about the heart, are internal. Well, these are exogenous Zeitgebers, and the way I remember these is because EX stands EX for exogenous, EX for external, because they are external environmental cues which help regulate the sleep-wake cycle. There's also the German translation, I think it's in the cat book, the dog book, for Zeitgeber as well. So if you're more comfortable with languages, you could break that definition down as well, and that might help you. If you like the Latin, the German would help as well. So what we say about exogenous Zeitgebers is that they support the entrainment or the entraining of endogenous pacemakers. So, and if you want to be fancy, if it's light that is the exogenous Zeitgeber, which is the key one that's doing the entraining, then you can call it photo entraining as well, because photo for light. Okay, and hopefully some of these images will stick in your memory. So, external environmental cues which help regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Well, we already know that light does do that, because we've talked about light regulating or being the thing that triggers the SCN. And we'll talk about a little bit of research later on that suggests that naturally our sleep-wake cycle falls at 25 hours, but light entrains it so it stays to 24, because that's fits with daylight and nighttime on Earth as well. Okay, so light affects the SCN, and you've also got the melanospin, apologies, which is a protein in the retina, and that judges the brightness of the light. So if the light is very, very bright, it sends information to the SCN telling the SCN that there's bright light, or if the light starts to get dimmer, it also picks up on that and sends that information to the SCN as well. Another less significant but still relevant exogenous Zeitgeber is social cues. And they can include things like meal times, people's behaviour, social activities, anything that you can think of. So if you imagine that you were you were teleported to somewhere else completely, just by looking around, particularly if it's in the UK, not necessarily in other countries, because obviously different cultures have different kind of behaviours, but you could probably work out from the type of food they were eating, and what time it was roughly. Was it breakfast? Was it lunch? Was it dinner? Possibly. The types of behaviours people were showing. So the way that people behave in the city centre, maybe at midday, is probably quite different to midnight, and the different things they do, and also the different social activities. So it's quite unusual maybe to see someone going out drinking, hopefully, at 9 o'clock in the morning. It'd be less unusual maybe to see somebody go for a run at 9 o'clock in the morning, and vice versa. You wouldn't expect someone to be going for a jog at 3 o'clock in the morning, although now you're all probably going to tell me that you do all those things, which will fit very much with the piece of research I'm going to talk about in a moment. They also found that a way of reducing jet lag, so jet lag is when you change a lot of time zones, so maybe it's when you go on holiday, and in Germany, they're 2 hours ahead, so you think it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it's actually 6 o'clock in the afternoon there, and obviously there's really significant jet lag time zones that you pass when you go further away, and they found that people who went out more exposed themselves more to social cues in the place where they have the destination they've just landed in. So they're starting to pick up, or people are eating dinner now, people are starting to go to bed now, things are less busy, things are more busy. Those immersing themselves in those social cues help reduce the amount of jet lag they felt, because the social cue was in training their endogenous pacemaker. So the exogenous Zeitgeber of the social cue was in training their endogenous pacemaker. And the same with, because they're out and then were exposed more, then they'd be more exposed to light at the time. So it was bright when they should be awake, and it was dark when they should be asleep in the new culture. Okay. Evaluation points for circadian rhythms. Let's have a look. So you do need to know that the essay could be about circadian rhythms, endogenous pacemakers, or exogenous Zeitgebers. So you do need to be aware of all three different ones. However, I have tried to overlap them, and if you feel that you could tailor every single one to another topic, the circadian rhythm ones to say the endogenous pacemakers, then you do that. I don't mind. It's all about if you can link it back at the end though. So we've got Sharif's cave study. So this is mentioned in the dog book. This is where Sharif put himself into a cave for several months, so didn't expose himself to any exogenous side gabers, and wanted to looked at how that affected his circadian rhythm. And the same with Ashcroft and Weaver. They put some people into a World War II bunker, and there is more detail about this in your dog book that you can have a read of as well. And again, they weren't exposed to exogenous side gabers, and they still found that just with their endogenous pacemakers, their internal body clock, they found between a 24 and a 25-hour sleep-wake cycle. So that sleep-wake cycle did exist, suggesting circadian rhythms, particularly motivated by internal pacemakers, internal mechanisms, did exist. There is practical applications. I think you'll quite enjoy this one. This is from Kelly from 2017, who found that starting school, or school starting at 10 a.m. led to a 12% increase in academic progress and a 50% decrease in student absence and student illness. And that is because the circadian rhythms of teenagers, so this was on research 13 to 16-year-olds, so you're just a little bit too old, unfortunately, but I think we could still use it. I have emailed the research to Matt. They have slightly delayed circadian rhythms. Their circadian rhythm starts later, so they should be waking up later, and it's biologically we're asking young people to wake up earlier than they should do. So we're almost causing jet lag every single day because the circadian rhythm is slightly delayed in teenagers. And this piece of research found that by shifting it from 9 o'clock start to 10 o'clock start, there was a lot of improvements in people's behaviour, suggesting that, of course, circadian rhythms do exist, even though there are individual differences. So, yeah, it's a useful piece of research. We should, I would support doing that wholeheartedly. However, a problem with it is that, as you can see from the above, there's lots and lots of case studies which don't control for individual differences. So Duffy found that there were owls and larks. So owls are people who prefer to stay up later at night, and larks are people who prefer to get up early in the morning. So obviously that's a difference within their circadian rhythm, and that's not always necessarily factored into research. And also things like age. So for example, Sharif did that piece of research again when he was 60. So he went back into the cave when he was 60, but he was much younger, in his 20s, when he did the cave study before, and he found that he had a much longer circadian rhythm of 48 hours. And of course we've just looked at Kelly, who suggests that teenagers have an altered, delayed circadian rhythm as well. So individual case studies don't really control for those individual differences, don't really support them.